I woke up to a letter taped to my door in bold red ink. Final notice. You owe the HOA $500,000 in fines. My hands shook, not from fear, but from rage. That morning, I knew a war was coming. The paper felt thick between my fingers. Expensive stock, the kind that screams authority. The HOA logo glared back at me like a predator's eye, embossed in gold foil that caught the morning sun. I could smell the fresh ink still drying, as if they'd rushed this threat to my doorstep while I slept. The sound of paper crumpling in my fist was the only thing I heard above the blood pounding in my ears. $500,000. $500,000. The number danced before my eyes like a death sentence written in corporate letterhead. This wasn't some petty dispute over grass height or mailbox placement. This was financial warfare designed to destroy me completely. I stood there in my bathrobe, barefoot on the cold concrete of my driveway, reading through the itemized list of alleged violations that stretched across 3 pages. Unauthorized exterior paint color deviation, $15,000. Improper landscaping materials, $25,000. Repeated mailbox infractions, $50,000. Each line item more absurd than the last, each fine calculated to bleed me dry. The neighborhood was stirring to life around me. Mrs. Henderson across the street peeked through her curtains, then quickly looked away when our eyes met. The Johnsons next door suddenly found their morning newspaper fascinating enough to study for 10 minutes. I could feel their whispers already spreading through the subdivision like wildfire. Did you see what happened to Mike? The HOA finally got him. For months, they'd been watching this slow-motion execution. I was the cautionary tale, the example they'd used to keep everyone else in line. Look what happens when you don't follow the rules. Look what happens when you fight back. But as I stood there, letter trembling in my grip, I felt something they hadn't counted on. Not fear, fury. White-hot, crystalline fury that cut through the shock like a blade. They thought they knew everything about me. They thought they had me cornered. They had no idea what they'd just unleashed. I looked up from the letter to see him, Harold Morrison, the HOA president himself, standing at the end of his perfectly manicured driveway 3 houses down. He was collecting his newspaper, but his eyes were locked on mine. Even from 50 yards away, I could see the smug satisfaction painted across his face. He'd been waiting for this moment, savoring it. Harold was tall and lean, the kind of man who wore pressed khakis and polo shirts like armor. His silver hair was combed with mathematical precision, and he moved through the world with the confidence of someone who'd spent decades believing his own authority was absolute. He nodded at me, not a greeting, but an acknowledgement. A predator, recognizing its prey. I stared back, my jaw clenched so tight I could hear my teeth grinding. This was his moment of triumph, the culmination of months of calculated harassment. He wanted me to break. He wanted me to beg. He wanted me to pack my bags and disappear, leaving behind everything I'd worked for. Instead, I folded the letter carefully, creasing each edge with deliberate precision. I tucked it under my arm and walked back toward my front door with measured steps. I could feel his eyes following me, waiting for the panic, the desperate phone calls, the frantic scrambling of a man watching his life collapse. But Harold Morrison had made a critical error. He thought he was dealing with just another homeowner, another victim to be ground beneath the wheels of his petty tyranny. He didn't know about the phone calls I'd been making. He didn't know about the documents I'd been reviewing. He didn't know about the secret that was about to turn his carefully constructed empire to ash. As I reached my front door, I turned back one last time. Harold was still watching, still savoring what he believed was his victory. I raised my hand in a small wave. Not surrender, but promise. The war he wanted was coming, but not the way he expected. The door closed behind me with a soft click that echoed like the sound of a trap being set. I had work to do. The kitchen counter became my command center as I spread the letter flat, photographing each page with clinical precision. The morning coffee grew cold as I began making calls. To my attorney, to my accountant, to contacts I hadn't spoken to in years. Each conversation was brief, coded, urgent. "It's time," I told my lawyer. They just made their biggest mistake. Outside, the neighborhood continued its morning routine, oblivious to the fact that everything was about to change. Children waited. For school buses, sprinklers watered pristine lawns, and the HOA's reign of terror continued exactly as it had for years. But in my kitchen, studying that letter like a battle plan, I knew something they didn't. Harold Morrison and his board of petty tyrants had just handed me the keys to their destruction. They'd been so focused on bleeding me dry that they'd forgotten one crucial detail, a detail that would bring their entire kingdom crashing down. Tutu, war they wanted was about to begin, and I was going to win it using their own building. They weren't just a homeowners association, they were a cartel in polo shirts. Looking back, I should have seen the signs earlier. What started as a typical suburban HOA had mutated into something far more sinister under Harold Morrison's leadership. He'd transformed a community organization into his personal fiefdom, complete with enforcers, informants, and a system of rules designed not to maintain property values, but to generate revenue through fear. It began small, as these things always do. 3 years ago, when I first moved to Willowbrook Estates, the violations were almost quaint. A polite letter about my trash cans being visible from the street after 7 p.m. A gentle reminder that my mailbox needed touching up. Standard HOA stuff that I paid without thinking twice. But Harold had bigger plans. The first red flag came when I received a violation for my lawn being inconsistent with community standards. I'd hired a professional landscaping company, spent thousands on premium sod, and maintained it religiously. When I called the HOA office to dispute the fine, Harold's assistant, a nervous woman named Patricia, whispered that I should just pay it. "It's easier that way," she said, glancing over her shoulder as if someone might be listening. "Mr. Morrison doesn't like it when people argue." That weekend, I walked the neighborhood to see what community standards actually meant. The Hendersons had brown patches in their front yard. The Kowalskis had dandelions scattered across their lawn like yellow confetti. The Patels had given up on grass entirely and installed decorative rocks. None of them had violations posted. But Mrs. Chen down the block, she had a citation for excessive green density in her yard. The Yamadas got fined for non-conforming plant species when they planted native wildflowers. The new family, the Garcias, received 17 separate violations in their first month, ranging from incorrect mulch color to unauthorized decorative elements for a small garden gnome. The Tuan pattern became clear. If Harold liked you, rules were suggestions. If he didn't, rules were weapons. I started keeping a notebook, documenting the selective enforcement like a detective building a case. Harold's friends got warnings. Everyone else got fines. His poker buddies could leave their boats in driveways for weeks. The widow next to them got cited for parking her late husband's classic car there overnight. The board meetings became theaters of humiliation. Harold would sit at the head of a long table in the community center, flanked by his lieutenants, Bob Kruger, the retired insurance adjuster who treated violations like insurance fraud investigations, and Susan Walsh, a former PTA president, who'd weaponized her organizational skills for maximum bureaucratic cruelty. I attended my first board meeting to dispute the lawn violation. The community center felt like a courthouse, with Harold elevated behind his table, while residents sat in folding chairs like defendants waiting for judgment. The air was thick with tension and the smell of burnt coffee from an ancient pot in the corner. "Mr. Davidson," Harold announced when my turn came, not looking up from his paperwork. "Violation 2024-157. Inconsistent lawn maintenance standards." I stood, my prepared speech ready. "I'd like to explain. The violation stands," he cut me off. "The fine is $250 plus a $50 processing fee for this hearing." Next. "But I haven't even—" "Mr. Davidson, you can pay the fine or we can add contempt of proceedings to your violations. Your choice." The room was silent. 23 homeowners sat frozen, afraid to make eye contact with me or with Harold. I could hear someone's breathing behind me, quick and shallow. In the corner, Patricia typed furiously on her laptop, recording every word for what I now realized was a permanent record of dissent. I paid the fine. But that night, lying awake in bed, I made a decision that would change everything. I wasn't going to be another victim. I was going to learn their game better than they played it. The harassment escalated after that meeting, as if Harold had marked me as a troublemaker. Violation notices appeared with increasing frequency, each one more creative than the last. My front door was non-conforming burgundy instead of approved brown. My mailbox post was 3 inches too tall. The decorative stones around my flower beds were river rock instead of approved gravel. Each violation came with escalating fines. $100 became $250. $250 became $500. When I tried to correct the issues, they'd find new problems. Paint the door brown, and suddenly the trim was too white. Lower the mailbox, and now it was too short. Replace the river rock with gravel, and they'd cite me for inadequate landscaping boundaries. The final straw came on a Tuesday in March. I was working from home when I heard voices in my backyard. Through the window, I watched Harold himself, walking around my property with Bob Kruger and a woman I didn't recognize carrying a camera. They were documenting everything: the patio furniture placement, the small shed where I kept lawn equipment, even the bird feeder I'd hung from an oak tree. When I stepped outside, Harold didn't even have the grace to look embarrassed. "Just conducting a routine inspection, Mr. Davidson," he said, making notes on his clipboard. "We've had complaints." "From who?" "That's confidential." He gestured toward my back fence, "But I can see several violations already. This fence staining is inconsistent with community standards. The shed lacks proper permits. And that bird feeder—" He shook his head sadly. "Wildlife attraction devices aren't permitted without board approval." I watched them photograph my property like crime scene investigators, knowing that each picture would become another fine, another attempt to bleed me into submission. They weren't just targeting my house, they were targeting my life, my peace of mind, my ability to exist in my own home without fear. That evening, I sat at my kitchen table with a calculator and a stack of violation notices, adding up what they'd already cost me. $12,000 in 8 months. At this rate, they'd bankrupt me within 2 years. But as I sat there, staring at Harold's signature on notice after notice, I remembered something he didn't know. Something that would make all of this calculation seem very different when viewed from the other side. The war was escalating, but Harold Morrison had no idea he was fighting someone who could fight back from inside his own headquarters. It felt like living under surveillance, like the HOA had planted cameras in my walls. The harassment reached a fever pitch in the weeks following that backyard inspection. Harold and his board had tasted blood, and they were circling for the kill. Every day brought new violations, each one more absurd than the last, as if they were testing the limits of how far they could push before I broke completely. The notices started arriving in clusters, 3 on Monday. My driveway had micro cracks that compromise community aesthetics, 1,500. My house numbers weren't regulation font style, 750, and my outdoor light fixture was inconsistent with approved colonial styling, 1,250. Tuesday brought 2 more, unauthorized use of cream paint instead of eggshell white, $2,000, and improper mailbox flag positioning, 500. I measured the paint colors with professional color matching equipment. They were identical. I bought a protractor to check the mailbox flag angle. It was exactly perpendicular as required. None of it mattered. The violations kept coming like an avalanche, each one signed in Harold's precise handwriting, each one demanding payment within 15 days. The psychological warfare was just as calculated as the financial assault. They'd time the notices to arrive just as I was leaving for work, forcing me to start each day with a fresh dose of dread. Sometimes Patricia would personally deliver them, her hands shaking as she taped them to my door, unable to make eye contact. Other times I'd find them tucked under my windshield wipers or slipped through my mail slot at odd hours. Bob Kruger began what he called routine patrols of the neighborhood, armed with a digital camera and a measuring tape. He'd appear at random times, early morning when I was drinking coffee, late evening when I was watering plants, weekend afternoons when I was trying to relax in my backyard, always watching, always documenting, always finding something wrong. Just doing my job, he'd say with a shrug when I confronted him about photographing my house from the sidewalk. Community standards don't maintain themselves. The worst part was watching my neighbors' reactions. People I'd shared barbecues with now hurried past without making eye contact. The Hendersons stopped waving. The Kowalskis began parking their car to block their view of my house. Even the mailman started avoiding conversation, as if association with me might somehow contaminate him. Susan Walsh proved to be Harold's most effective weapon. Where Bob was obvious in his intimidation, Susan was subtle, poisonous. She'd organize concerned neighbor meetings that I wasn't invited to, spreading rumors about my attitude problem and disrespect for community values. She turned my violation count into neighborhood gossip, making sure everyone knew exactly how much trouble I was in. "It's really sad," I overheard her telling Mrs. Patterson at the grocery store. "Some people just can't handle living in a community with standards. Maybe he'd be happier somewhere less organized." The financial pressure was becoming real. 15,000 in fines had become 25,000. 25 became 40. When I tried to dispute them through the official channels, Harold's response was always the same: pay the fines or face legal action. When I requested the specific code sections I'd allegedly violated, they sent me a 847-page HOA covenant document that seemed to have been written by lawyers specifically to be incomprehensible. Then came the masterstroke that nearly broke me. I'd been quietly trying to sell the house, hoping to escape before they could bankrupt me completely. 3 separate buyers had shown serious interest, and I thought I might finally have a way out. That's when I received the certified letter that changed everything. Notice of Lion Placement, it read in bold letters across the top. Due to outstanding HOA violations totaling $47,500, a lien has been placed on your property pending resolution of all outstanding fines and fees. The lien made the house unsellable. No buyer could get clear title, no mortgage company would approve financing, and no title company would issue insurance. With one piece of paper, Harold had trapped me in my own home like a prisoner in a luxurious cell. I called my real estate agent in a panic. Jennifer had been selling homes in the area for 15 years, and even she was shocked by the HOA's tactics. "I've never seen anything like this," she admitted over the phone. Usually, HOAs work with homeowners to resolve issues before it gets to liens. This feels vindictive. Vindictive was exactly right. This wasn't about maintaining property values or enforcing reasonable community standards. This was about power, control, and the systematic destruction of anyone who dared to question Harold Morrison's authority. That night, I couldn't sleep. I paced the house that had become my prison, calculating and recalculating numbers that didn't add up to anything but financial ruin. At this rate, they'd force me into bankruptcy within months, even if I somehow came up with the money to pay. The existing fines, there was nothing stopping them from inventing new ones. The harassment would continue until I was completely broken or completely gone. I stood at my bedroom window, looking out at the neighborhood I'd once been proud to call home. Harold's house was dark, except for one window, his home office, where he was probably planning tomorrow's violations. The community center sat silent in the distance, its parking lot empty, except for security lights that cast long shadows across the pavement. That's when it hit me. Really hit me. What I'd been sitting on this entire time. 3 years ago, when I'd first moved to Willowbrook Estates, I'd been flush with success from a commercial real estate deal. One of my investments was a small office building downtown. Nothing fancy, just a reliable income property that I barely thought about once the tenants were in place and the rent was flowing. I'd been so focused on defending my home that I'd forgotten about my weapon. The HOA headquarters wasn't in some grand municipal building or corporate complex. It was 3 floors of rented space in a modest office building on Main Street. The same building where I collected rent checks every month. The same building where I'd just approved a lease renewal 18 months ago without even paying attention to which specific tenant had signed the paperwork. Harold Morrison and his board of tyrants had been torturing me from inside a building I owned. The irony was so perfect, it almost felt like divine intervention. They'd been so focused on grinding me down with petty fines and violations that they'd never bothered to check who owned the space they rented for their reign of terror. Their entire operation, the filing cabinets full of violation notices, the conference room where they held their kangaroo court hearings, the desk where Harold signed his name to document after document designed to destroy me, all of it was happening on my property. For the first time in months, I smiled. Not the defeated grimace I'd been wearing, but a genuine predatory smile that probably would have terrified Harold if he could have seen it. The war was about to take a very different turn. Harold wanted to play games with property rights and legal technicalities. I was about to teach him that 2 could play that game, and I owned the board. They thought they owned me, but they forgot I owned something far more dangerous. Sleep was impossible that night. I sat at my kitchen table until dawn, surrounded by documents I'd pulled from my home office. Lease agreements, property deeds, mortgage papers, and rental records dating back 5 years. The coffee maker gurgled through pot after pot as I traced the paper trail that would become Harold Morrison's nightmare. The building was called Meridian Plaza, though the name was far grander than the reality. It was a modest 3-story brick structure built in the 1980s, the kind of solid but unremarkable commercial property that smart investors buy and hold forever. I'd purchased it in 2019 as part of a portfolio expansion, attracted by its steady rental income and minimal maintenance requirements. The first floor housed a dental practice and a small accounting firm. The second floor was divided between a law office and an insurance agency. The third floor, the entire third floor, was leased to something called Community Management Services, LLC. I'd never paid much attention to community management services. They paid their rent on time, never complained about maintenance issues, and had signed a 3-year lease with automatic renewal options. As far as I was concerned, they were model tenants. Until now, I'd never bothered to investigate exactly what they did in that third-floor space. The lease was a standard commercial agreement, nothing unusual except for one detail that now seemed like a gift from the gods. A clause requiring 60 days' notice for lease termination by either party, and specific language about maintaining professional standards consistent with the building's reputation. But the real treasure was buried in the renewal paperwork from 18 months ago. There, in neat corporate letterhead, was the truth I'd been too distracted to notice. Community Management Services, LLC, was wholly owned by the Willowbrook Estates Homeowners Association. Harold Morrison's signature was on the lease as president and authorized agent. They'd been paying me rent to run their extortion operation. For 3 years, Harold had been signing checks to my property management company every month, funding his war chest with money that ultimately flowed back to me. The beautiful symmetry of it almost made up for months of harassment. Almost. I called my property manager first thing Monday morning. Janet had been handling Meridian Plaza since I bought it, and she knew every tenant's business better than they did themselves. Community Management Services? She laughed when I asked about them. Oh, that's the HOA people. They do management services for several subdivisions around town. Willowbrook Estates is their biggest client, I think. Nice office setup, conference, rooms, filing systems, the works. Why do you ask? Just curious, I said carefully. Have there been any issues with them? Complaints from other tenants? Not really. Though the dental office downstairs mentioned they have a lot of evening meetings. People coming and going, sometimes heated discussions. But they're quiet during business hours, and they always clean up after themselves. After hanging up, I drove downtown to see the building with new eyes. I'd visited occasionally to check on maintenance issues, but I'd never really paid attention to the third floor. Now I studied it like a general surveying a battlefield. The HOA's logo was displayed prominently in the front window. Willowbrook Estates Community Management Services. Through the glass, I could see a reception area with Patricia's desk, a TE conference room with a long table where I'd sat for those humiliating board meetings, and several private offices beyond. File cabinets lined the walls, no doubt stuffed with violation notices, resident complaints, and financial records documenting 3 years of systematic harassment. It was surreal, standing on the sidewalk, looking up at my own building, knowing that Harold Morrison was probably up there right now planning new ways to torment me, completely unaware that his entire operation existed at my pleasure. But I couldn't just march upstairs and throw them out. This needed to be surgical, precise, devastating. Harold had spent months building a legal and financial web designed to trap me. I was going to use that same methodical approach to dismantle everything he'd built. The first step was research. I spent the next week at the county courthouse, pulling property records, business registrations, and financial documents. The Willowbrook Estates HOA was surprisingly complex for a neighborhood organization. Multiple LLCs, property management contracts, and a budget that seemed inflated for a community of 200 homes. More interesting were the complaints filed against them. I wasn't their only target. The county records showed a pattern of aggressive enforcement actions, lien placements, and legal threats stretching back to Harold's election as president. They'd perfected their system of financial harassment, and I was just the latest victim in a long line of homeowners who'd been ground down by their machine. But I also found their vulnerabilities. Community management services had been operating without proper business licenses for 2 years. Their nonprofit status was questionable given the revenue they were generating from fines. Most importantly, their lease agreement with me included specific clauses about maintaining professional business standards that their harassment campaign clearly violated. I made copies of everything, organizing the documents like a prosecutor preparing for trial. Financial records showing excessive fine revenue. Complaint patterns revealing discriminatory enforcement. Business registration gaps that suggested possible tax violations. And at the center of it all, the lease agreement that gave me the power to shut down their entire operation. The irony was delicious. Harold thought he was a master of bureaucratic warfare, wielding rules and regulations like weapons against helpless homeowners. But he'd forgotten the first rule of warfare: know your enemy's capabilities. He'd been so focused on attacking my home that he'd never bothered to investigate my other assets. That weekend, I sat in my backyard, the same backyard where Harold had conducted his inspection, and planned my counterattack. Every violation notice they'd sent me, every fine they'd levied, every humiliating board meeting where they'd treated me like a criminal, it all came back to that third-floor office space in my building. They wanted to play property games? I was about to show them what real property power looked like. The hardest part was waiting. Every instinct screamed at me to act immediately, to march into their office and announce that their landlord was shutting them down. But Harold had been patient in building his campaign against me, and I needed to be just as patient in destroying him. I used the time to shore up my legal position, consultations with commercial real estate attorneys, reviews of tenant law, and careful documentation of every violation of their lease terms. The harassment campaign they were running against me wasn't just morally wrong, it was a direct violation of the Professional Standards Clause in their rental agreement. I also began reaching out to other homeowners who'd been targeted by the HOA's enforcement machine. Quiet conversations over coffee, careful inquiries about their experiences, building a network of allies who might be ready to act when the time came. But mostly, I savored the secret knowledge that every day Harold Morrison went to work. He was walking into my building to plan attacks against me using space I owned. Every board meeting where they plotted new violations was happening on my property. Every fine they calculated, every threat they drafted, every smug conversation about their latest victim was taking place in rooms where I paid the utilities. It was the perfect position for a counterattack, and Harold had handed it to me without even realizing it. Soon, very soon, I was going to use their own headquarters to destroy them. The war was about to turn, and they had no idea what was coming. When the neighbors found out I was fighting back, they came to me like ghosts in the night. The first to approach me was Elena Vasquez, a pediatric nurse who lived in the cul-de-sac behind mine. She knocked on my door at 9:30 on a Wednesday evening, looking nervously over her shoulder as if she expected Harold Morrison himself to leap from the shadows. "I need to talk to you," she whispered, clutching a manila folder against her, chest like armor. "About the HOA, about what they've been doing." I invited her in, brewing coffee while she sat rigidly at my kitchen table, still glancing toward the windows as if we were being watched. When she finally opened that folder, her hands were shaking. "They've fined me $18,000, she said quietly, "for having the wrong color roses." The documents she spread across my table told a story of harassment that made my own troubles look mild by comparison. Elena, a single mother working double shifts at the hospital, had planted a small rose garden in her front yard 2 years ago. Red roses, perfectly maintained, absolutely beautiful. The HOA had initially approved the landscaping plan, but when Elena refused to vote for Harold's re-election, the roses suddenly became a problem. Non-conforming botanical elements, according to the first violation. When she replaced them with white roses, those were inconsistent with neighborhood color schemes. Pink roses were too vibrant. Yellow roses attracted inappropriate wildlife. "I've replanted that garden 6 times, she said, tears forming in her eyes. Each time, they wait a month, then find a new violation. The fines keep adding up, and I'm going to lose my house." Her story was devastating, but it wasn't unique. Over the next 2 weeks, as word quietly spread that I was fighting back, more neighbors began appearing at my door, always after dark, always nervous, always carrying folders full of documentation, proving that Harold's campaign wasn't just personal, it was systematic. Mrs. Chen, the elderly widow whose excessive green density violation had first caught my attention, brought records showing $23,000 in fines for maintaining a beautiful lawn that was allegedly too healthy compared to community standards. The Yamadas showed me citations for their native wildflower garden that started at $500 and escalated to $5,000 per month until they finally gave in and installed bland-approved shrubs. The most heartbreaking was Tommy Garcia, a young father who'd bought his house 6 months ago with dreams of starting fresh in a family-friendly neighborhood. The HOA had welcomed him with a smile during the purchase process, then hit him with violations starting on day 1. 17 fines in the first month, he said bitterly, showing me photos of his house from different angles. Wrong mailbox, wrong doormat, wrong address numbers, wrong light bulbs in the porch fixture. They said my children's bicycles were recreational equipment visible from the street. I can't let my kids ride bikes in their own driveway. But Tommy had brought more than just his own story. As a software engineer, he'd done something the rest of us hadn't thought of. He'd analyzed the data. "I pulled every HOA violation for the past 3 years, he said, opening his laptop to show me a detailed spreadsheet. Demographics, addresses, voting records from HOA elections, even property values. The pattern is clear." His analysis was damning. Families with children received violations at twice the rate of childless households. Minority homeowners were fined an average of 340% more than white residents. Anyone who'd voted against Harold in the last election had received an average of $12,000 more in fines than his supporters. "This isn't about maintaining property values," Tommy concluded. "This is about control, intimidation, and frankly, it's probably illegal discrimination." The most valuable ally came from an unexpected source. Judge Patricia Reeves had retired to Willowbrook Estates 3 years ago, buying a modest ranch house where she planned to spend her golden years reading mystery novels and tending her garden. She'd kept a low profile, avoiding HOA politics and staying out of neighborhood drama, until Harold made the mistake of targeting her friend. "Elena is a good person," Judge Reeves said during our first meeting in my living room. She was a small woman with silver hair and steel-gray eyes that probably terrorized lawyers for 30 years. "What they're doing to her, to all of you, is unconscionable. More importantly, it's illegal." Judge Reeves had been quietly studying the HOA's enforcement patterns from a legal perspective, and her conclusions were devastating. Selective enforcement, discriminatory practices, violation of due process rights, and probable breach of fiduciary duty, she listed, counting off on her fingers. Harold Morrison is running this association like a personal kingdom, but HOA boards have legal obligations they're clearly ignoring. She'd also been researching Harold himself, using her connections in the legal community to dig into his background. You know he was sanctioned by the state bar 3 times before he retired? She asked. Twice for client fund violations, once for frivolous litigation. He's exactly the kind of person who shouldn't be trusted with authority over other people's property rights. But the most important ally was David Park, a forensic accountant who'd moved to the neighborhood 18 months ago. David was quiet, methodical, and possessed the specific skills we needed to expose the HOA's financial misconduct. Something doesn't add up, he said during our second clandestine meeting. I've been analyzing the HOA's published budgets against the fine revenue they're generating. There are significant discrepancies. David had obtained copies of the HOA's financial statements through public records requests, and his analysis suggested systemic financial mismanagement or worse. They're collecting nearly twice the fine revenue they report, he explained, showing us his calculations. Either they're incredibly bad at bookkeeping or someone is skimming money. Given the harassment patterns you've all described, I'm leaning toward the latter. Our group met every few nights, rotating between different houses to avoid detection. We called ourselves the Willowbrook 7, Elena, Mrs. Chen, the Yamadas, Tommy, Judge Reeves, David, and me. What had started as individual harassment campaigns was revealed to be something much larger, a systematic scheme to extract money from homeowners while consolidating power in Harold's hands. Judge Reeves helped us understand our legal options. David tracked the financial irregularities. Tommy documented the discrimination patterns. The rest of us provided evidence, testimony, and moral support for what we all knew was coming. A final confrontation with Harold Morrison and his board. But I had something the others didn't know about yet. The ace up my sleeve that would make all of our evidence irrelevant. As we planned our legal strategy and gathered documentation, I was quietly preparing for a much more direct approach. Every night after our meetings, I'd drive past Meridian Plaza and look up at the third-floor windows where Harold's operation was headquartered. Sometimes the lights were still on, Harold and his cronies probably planning new ways to terrorize the neighborhood. They had no idea they were sitting in my building, paying me rent to fund their harassment campaign, completely vulnerable to eviction the moment I decided to act. The legal battle my allies were preparing would take months, possibly years. The discrimination evidence would require lengthy investigations. The financial misconduct would need forensic analysis and regulatory involvement. But I could end Harold Morrison's reign of terror with 60 days' notice. The question was timing. Strike too early, and they might find a way to relocate and continue their campaign from elsewhere. Wait too long, and more neighbors would be financially ruined by their harassment machine. The answer came during our last secret meeting before I made my move. Elena was crying again, having received another $3,000 fine for improper garden maintenance schedule. Apparently, she'd been caught watering her flowers at 7:15 a.m. instead of the approved 7:30 a.m. window. I can't fight anymore, she whispered. I'm going to sell the house to a cash buyer and take whatever I can get. I can't afford to keep living here. That's when I knew it was time. Harold Morrison wanted a war? He was about to get one. But it wouldn't be fought in courtrooms or regulatory hearings. It would be fought in his own headquarters, using the one weapon he'd never seen coming. The building they rented to destroy us was about to destroy them instead. The day of the board meeting, I walked into their headquarters like a man entering a battlefield, except the battlefield was mine. The emergency board meeting was scheduled for Thursday evening at 7 o'clock. Harold had sent notices to every homeowner in Willowbrook Estates, the subject line reading, "Final resolution of outstanding violations." Everyone knew what that meant. They were planning to foreclose on my house. I spent the morning making final preparations. The eviction notice was drafted, reviewed by 3 different attorneys, and signed with the same precision Harold used for his violation letters. The lease termination papers were perfect, legally bulletproof, and professionally devastating. Most importantly, I'd arranged for a locksmith to be standing by. At 6:30, I put on my best suit, the same navy blue I'd worn to close million-dollar real estate deals. If this was going to be theater, I wanted to look the part. In my briefcase, I carried copies of the lease agreement, the eviction notice, and a folder full of documentation that would end Harold Morrison's career as a neighborhood tyrant. The Willowbrook 7 were already there when I arrived at Meridian Plaza. They'd positioned themselves strategically throughout the third-floor conference room, Elena near the back exit, Judge Reeves in the front row where Harold couldn't ignore her, Tommy with his laptop ready to record everything. We'd planned this like a military operation, and everyone knew their role. Harold was holding court at the head of the conference table, looking more confident than I'd ever seen him. He wore a charcoal suit that probably cost more than most people's, monthly mortgage payments, and his silver hair was styled with extra care. This was his moment of ultimate triumph, the night he'd finally rid Willowbrook Estates of its most troublesome resident. "Ladies and gentlemen," he began, his voice carrying the authority of someone accustomed to being obeyed, "we're here tonight to address a serious matter that affects our entire community." Bob Kruger and Susan Walsh flanked him like lieutenants, both wearing expressions of grim satisfaction. Patricia sat at a smaller table to the side, her laptop open, ready to record the proceedings that would document my destruction. Around the room, maybe 40 homeowners had gathered, some Harold's supporters, others simply afraid to stay away. "Mr. Davidson has accumulated over $50,000 in unpaid violations," Harold continued, opening a thick folder that contained my entire violation history. "Despite numerous opportunities to comply with community standards, he has chosen to ignore our lawful authority and disrupt the harmony of our neighborhood." The lies flowed smoothly from his mouth, each one delivered with the practiced confidence of someone who'd told them so often he'd begun to believe them himself. I was the problem. I was the one disrupting the community. I was the reason property values were at risk. "Therefore," Harold said, building to his crescendo, "the board has voted to exercise our legal authority and initiate foreclosure proceedings against Mr. Davidson's property. The lien we've placed will be enforced, and the house will be sold to recover the outstanding fines and fees." A murmur ran through the room, some gasps of shock from people who hadn't realized how far this had escalated, some nods of approval from Harold's supporters who'd been convinced I was a threat to their property values. Elena made eye contact with me from the back of the room, her expression mixing fear and hope. "Mr. Davidson," Harold said, turning his attention to me with theatrical formality, "you have the right to address the board before we finalize these proceedings. Would you like to make a statement?" This was it, the moment I'd been planning for weeks. I stood slowly, buttoning my suit jacket, letting the silence stretch until every eye in the room was focused on me. Harold was smiling slightly, expecting either a desperate plea for mercy or an angry outburst that would justify everything he'd done. He got neither. "Thank you, Harold," I said calmly. "I do have a few things to say." I opened my briefcase and pulled out the lease agreement, holding it up so everyone could see the official letterhead. "First, I'd like to congratulate everyone on choosing such beautiful headquarters for your organization. This is a lovely building, isn't it? Great location, professional atmosphere, perfect for the kind of community management services you provide here." Harold's smile faltered slightly. Something in my tone wasn't what he'd expected. Around the room, people were leaning forward, sensing that this wasn't going to be the surrender speech they'd anticipated. "I'm particularly impressed by how well-maintained the building is," I continued, walking slowly toward Harold's table. "The landlord clearly takes pride in his property. Makes sure the tenants are professional, respectable businesses that reflect well on the building's reputation." Now Harold was frowning, trying to figure out where this was going. Bob Kruger and Susan Walsh exchanged confused glances. Patricia had stopped typing, her fingers frozen over the keyboard. "Which brings me to my main point," I said, placing the lease agreement on the table directly in front of Harold. "As the owner of this building, I've been conducting my own review of tenant behavior and compliance with lease terms." The words hung in the air like a bomb waiting to explode. Harold stared down at the lease agreement, his brain processing what I'd just said, but not quite believing it. Around the room, people were sitting up straighter, realizing that something unprecedented was happening. "You see," I continued, my voice carrying to every corner of the room, "Community Management Services, LLC, that's your organization, Harold, has been renting this space from me for 3 years, and I'm afraid your recent activities have placed you in serious violation of your lease terms." Harold's face had gone completely white. He picked up the lease agreement with shaking hands, scanning the signature line where his own name appeared as the authorized representative. The document was real, the signatures were authentic, and the implications were devastating. The lease specifically requires tenants to maintain professional standards consistent with the building's reputation. I quoted from memory. "Running a systematic harassment campaign against your own landlord doesn't quite meet that standard." The room erupted. 40 people started talking at once, voices rising in shock, confusion, and excitement. Harold was frantically flipping through the lease pages, looking for some escape clause, some way to undo what was happening. Bob Kruger had turned pale, while Susan Walsh looked like she was about to be sick. I raised my hand for quiet, and remarkably, the room fell silent. "Effective immediately," I announced, pulling the eviction notice from my briefcase. "I am terminating your lease and requiring you to vacate these premises within 60 days. Your organization's harassment campaign, discriminatory enforcement, practices, and systematic violation of homeowners' rights constitute a material breach of your rental agreement." I placed the eviction notice next to the lease agreement, both documents now lying in front of Harold like evidence at a trial. "Furthermore," I continued, "I've instructed building security to change the locks tomorrow morning. Your access to these offices, your files, your conference room, and your ability to conduct business from this location ends at midnight tonight." The silence was deafening. Harold stared at the papers as if they might burst into flames. His mouth opened and closed several times, but no words came out. The man who'd spent months terrorizing homeowners with bureaucratic precision had been undone by his own failure to check the ownership of his headquarters. This is impossible," he finally stammered. "You can't. We have a lease. We have rights." "You had a lease," I corrected. "And you had rights, both of which you forfeited when you decided to wage war against your own landlord. The irony is beautiful, don't you think? All those violation notices you sent me, all those fines you calculated, all those threats you made, you were doing it from my building, using my space, paying me rent for the privilege of harassing me." Around the room, people were laughing now. Not cruel laughter, but the sound of relief and justice finally being served. Elena was crying again, but these were tears of joy. Judge Reeves was smiling with professional appreciation for a perfectly executed legal maneuver. Harold tried one last desperate play. "The board will sue you," he shouted, his composure finally cracking completely. "We'll fight this. We'll take you to court." "With what?" I asked calmly. "With the legal fund you've been embezzling? With the discriminatory practices David Park has documented? With the selective enforcement patterns Judge Reeves has been analyzing? By all means, Harold, take me to court. I look forward to discovery." That's when Harold Morrison, the man who'd terrorized an entire neighborhood with his petty tyranny, finally broke. He slumped in his chair like a deflated balloon, staring at the eviction notice as if it were his death warrant. Because, in a way, it was. Without their headquarters, without their files, without their ability to hold meetings and issue violations, the HOA's reign of terror was over. Harold's empire had been built on paperwork and intimidation, and I'd just pulled the foundation out from under both. "Ladies and gentlemen," I said, addressing the room one final time, "I suggest you elect a new board, one that understands the difference between maintaining community standards and systematically harassing your neighbors. One that treats homeowners like human beings instead of revenue sources." I packed my briefcase, nodded to my allies, and walked toward the door. As I reached the exit, I turned back for one last look at Harold Morrison, slumped in defeat at the head of a table in my conference room, surrounded by the wreckage of his own arrogance. "Oh, and Harold," I said, "you have until midnight to remove your personal belongings. After that, everything stays with the building. Consider it compensation for 3 years of harassment." I walked out of my own building, leaving behind a room full of people who were finally free from fear. The war was over, and Harold Morrison had lost it using his own headquarters as the battlefield. The best part? He'd been paying me rent the entire time. By the time I was done, the HOA wasn't fining anyone. They were begging for mercy. The next morning brought chaos that was beautiful to watch. I arrived at Meridian Plaza at 8 o'clock sharp, accompanied by a locksmith, a security guard, and David Park carrying bankers' boxes. The scene waiting for us was even better than I'd hoped. Harold Morrison was standing in the building's lobby, arguing frantically with the security guard I'd hired to monitor the situation overnight. His silver hair was disheveled, his expensive suit wrinkled, and his face carried the hollow look of a man who'd spent the night realizing his empire was crumbling. "You can't do this," he was shouting as we approached. "We have contracts. We have obligations to the community. This is illegal seizure." "Good morning, Harold," I said pleasantly. "I trust you received the certified copy of the eviction notice that was delivered to your home at 6 a.m. His response was a string of profanity that would have earned him a violation notice if his own HOA rules applied to him. Behind him, Bob, Kruger, and Susan Walsh were hauling cardboard boxes down the stairs, looking like refugees fleeing a disaster zone. The locksmith went to work, while Harold continued his tirade, each click of the new locks sounding like a nail in the coffin of his authority. I'd arranged for the security guard to supervise the removal of their personal belongings. They could take their desk accessories and personal files, but everything related to HOA business stayed in the building. "Those are confidential resident files," Susan Walsh protested, as David began inventorying the filing cabinets. "Those are business records of a company that just got evicted from my building," I corrected. "They're staying exactly where they are until the new HOA board decides what to do with them. The new locks were installed by 9:30. Harold and his cronies were officially locked out of their headquarters, standing in the parking lot with a few boxes of personal items and nowhere to go. The man who'd terrorized dozens of families, with bureaucratic precision, had been undone by the simple reality that he didn't own the space he'd been operating from. But the real collapse had only just begun. Within hours of the eviction, word spread through Willowbrook Estates like wildfire. Elena called everyone she knew. Judge Reeves made strategic phone calls to contacts in local government. Tommy posted updates on neighborhood social media groups that Harold had been too old-fashioned to monitor. By noon, there was a line of cars outside my house, homeowners who'd been victims of Harold's harassment campaign, all wanting to know what came next. I held an impromptu press conference on my front lawn, using the same driveway where I'd received that first violation notice for inconsistent lawn maintenance standards. "The old board is finished," I announced to the crowd of neighbors, reporters, and even a few city officials who'd been getting complaints about the HOA for years. Harold Morrison and his associates have been evicted from their headquarters for systematic harassment, discriminatory practices, and violation of their lease terms. The applause was spontaneous and heartfelt. Mrs. Chen was crying again, but these were tears of relief. The Garcia family had brought their children, who were finally allowed to leave their bicycles in their own driveway. Even some of Harold's former supporters were in the crowd, looking embarrassed but grateful to be free from his reign of terror. "What happens now?" someone called out. "We hold emergency elections," I replied. "We elect a board that serves the community instead of terrorizing it. And we go back to being neighbors instead of victims." The legal fallout was swift and devastating. Judge Reeves had spent the morning making phone calls to former colleagues, and by afternoon, multiple government agencies were opening investigations into the HOA's practices. The State Attorney General's office launched a probe into the financial irregularities David Park had documented. The Civil Rights Division began investigating the discriminatory enforcement patterns Tommy had analyzed. The IRS received reports about the questionable nonprofit status and potential embezzlement of fine revenue. Harold tried to fight back, hiring a lawyer to challenge the eviction and demanding access to the HOA's files. But his attorney took one look at the lease agreement, the violation of professional standards clause, and the documentation of harassment campaign, and quietly withdrew from the case. "Mr. Morrison," the lawyer reportedly told him, "you conducted a systematic harassment campaign against your own landlord from space you were renting from him. There's no legal theory in existence that makes that defensible." The financial investigations proved even more damaging. David Park's analysis had been conservative. The actual scope of the mismanagement was staggering. Over 3 years, Harold's board had collected nearly $400,000 in fines and fees, but only $180,000 had been properly recorded in the HOA's official budgets. The missing money had been funneled into administrative accounts, controlled personally by Harold, Bob, and Susan. They'd been paying themselves consulting fees, expense accounts, and bonuses that exceeded what most HOA board members would earn in legitimate compensation over a decade. "It's a textbook case of fiduciary breach," Judge Reeves explained during one of our evening meetings. "They turned the HOA into their personal piggy bank, using harassment and intimidation to generate revenue they could embezzle." The state regulators moved quickly once the evidence was clear. Within a week, Harold Morrison, Bob Kruger, and Susan Walsh were permanently banned from serving on any HOA board in the state. Criminal charges for embezzlement and harassment were filed a month later. But the most satisfying part wasn't the legal consequences. It was watching their community support evaporate. Harold's political network had been built on fear and the perception of power. Once he was evicted from his headquarters and exposed as a fraud, his supporters abandoned him faster than rats fleeing a sinking ship. The same neighbors who'd nodded approvingly at board meetings were suddenly shocked to learn about the harassment and embezzlement. I had no idea, was the constant refrain. I thought they were just maintaining standards. I never knew about the discrimination. The emergency election was held 3 weeks later in the community center, the same room where Harold had held his kangaroo court meetings. The difference was remarkable. Instead of a tense, fearful atmosphere, there was actual community spirit. People were laughing, talking, making connections with neighbors they'd been too intimidated to approach before. Elena Vasquez was elected president by a landslide. Judge Reeves agreed to serve as legal advisor. David Park became treasurer with a mandate to implement proper financial controls. Tommy Garcia was put in charge of updating the HOA's archaic rules to focus on actual community benefit rather than revenue generation. The new board's first act was to void every fine and violation issued during Harold's tenure, pending individual review. The liens were removed, the harassment stopped, and families like the Garcias were finally free to let their children play in their own yards. "We're going back to being a neighborhood," Elena announced at her first board meeting. "Not a police state." Harold made one last desperate attempt to regain control, showing up at the new board's first meeting to demand recognition as the legitimate president. The response was swift and final. Building security escorted him from the premises, and a restraining order was filed the next day. The man who'd once strutted through Willowbrook Estates like a dictator was reduced to driving slowly past his former kingdom, staring at houses where families were finally free to live without fear. His reign of terror had lasted 3 years and destroyed dozens of lives. His downfall had taken exactly 60 days. The poetic justice was perfect. Harold Morrison, who'd weaponized property rights and legal technicalities against innocent homeowners, had been destroyed by the same forces he'd used against others. The building he'd used as his fortress had become his prison, and the landlord he'd tried to bankrupt had turned out to be his executioner. As I watched him drive away from Willowbrook Estates for the last time, I couldn't help but smile. The war he'd started with a letter demanding $500,000 in fines had ended with his complete and total defeat, and he'd been paying me rent for the privilege of losing. When I walk through the neighborhood now, the silence is different. It's freedom, not fear. 6 months later, Willowbrook Estates had transformed into the community Harold Morrison had always claimed he was protecting. Children played in driveways, without fear of violations. Neighbors chatted over fences, without wondering if their conversations were being monitored for HOA compliance. The sound of laughter had replaced the whispered anxiety that had defined our neighborhood for 3 years. I was walking my dog on a Saturday morning when Elena Vasquez called out from her front yard, where she was tending the rose garden that had once cost her $18,000 in fines. "Mike, come see this," she said, beaming as she pointed to a spectacular array of roses in every color imaginable. Red, white, pink, yellow, even some purple ones I found at the nursery. The new board approved the Diversity Landscape Initiative unanimously. The irony wasn't lost on either of us. Under Harold's regime, Elena had been terrorized for the color of her roses. Now she was the president of an HOA that celebrated diversity in all its forms, botanical and otherwise. "How are the finances looking?" I asked, knowing that David Park's forensic accounting work was still ongoing. "Better than expected," Elena replied. "We recovered almost $200,000 from Harold's administrative accounts before his lawyers could hide it. The new budget eliminates most of the fine revenue. We're going back to reasonable dues and actual community improvements." The financial turnaround had been remarkable. Without the constant harassment campaign, the HOA's actual expenses had dropped dramatically. No more legal fees for lien placements. No more enforcement officer salaries for Bob Kruger's intimidation patrols. No more consulting fees that had lined Harold's pockets. More importantly, property values in Willowbrook Estates had actually increased since Harold's departure. Families were moving in specifically because word had spread about our neighborhood's transformation from HOA police state to genuine community. Real estate agents were marketing us as the subdivision that threw out their dictator and became functional again. The legal consequences for Harold and his cronies had been swift and severe. The criminal trials were still pending, but the civil settlements had been devastating. Harold had been forced to sell his house to pay restitution to the homeowners he'd harassed. Bob Kruger had declared bankruptcy. Susan Walsh had fled to another state to avoid the social stigma of her exposure as a neighborhood tyrant. But the most satisfying part wasn't watching their punishment. It was seeing the positive changes throughout the community. The Garcias had become neighborhood fixtures, with their children organizing impromptu games of street hockey that drew kids from all over Willowbrook Estates. Tommy had started a community tech support group, helping elderly neighbors with computers and smartphones. His data analysis skills, once used to document discrimination, were now focused on optimizing snow removal routes and community event planning. Mrs. Chen had transformed her excessively green lawn into a community garden where neighbors could grow vegetables and herbs together. The space that had once been the source of thousands of dollars in fines had become a gathering place for families sharing gardening tips and fresh produce. Judge Reeves had used her legal expertise to completely rewrite the HOA's governing documents, creating a system of checks and balances that would prevent future Harold Morrisons from seizing power. The new rules emphasized community benefit over revenue generation, with transparent processes and term limits that ensured no one could accumulate the kind of unchecked authority Harold had wielded. Even the physical landscape had changed. Without the restrictive color palettes and approved plant lists, Willowbrook Estates had bloomed into a riot of individual expression. Garden gnomes appeared without fear of violation notices. Halloween decorations stayed up as long as homeowners wanted them. Christmas lights reflected personal style rather than HOA compliance requirements. The old community center, where Harold had held his tribunals of intimidation, had been renovated into an actual community space. Children's birthday parties, neighborhood potlucks, and hobby clubs had replaced board meetings focused on finding new ways to fine residents. Most importantly, the culture of fear had been replaced by a culture of mutual support. When the Hendersons needed help with yard work after Mr. Henderson's surgery, neighbors showed up with rakes and edgers instead of violation notices. When a new family moved in, they were greeted with casseroles and welcome baskets instead of clipboards and measuring tapes. I had become something of a neighborhood legend, though I tried to downplay my role in Harold's downfall. People would point me out to visitors. That's Mike Davidson, the guy who owned the building the HOA was renting and evicted them from their own headquarters. The story had taken on mythic proportions, growing more dramatic with each retelling. But the real heroes were the neighbors who'd found the courage to stand up once they realized they weren't alone. Elena, who'd turned her persecution into presidency. Judge Reeves, who'd used her expertise to rebuild our community's legal foundation. David Park, who'd exposed the financial corruption that had funded Harold's harassment machine. Tommy Garcia, who'd documented the discrimination that none of us could ignore once we saw the data. The Willowbrook 7 had become the core of a neighborhood that actually functioned the way communities are supposed to work, through cooperation, mutual respect, and genuine care for each other's welfare. On this particular Saturday morning, as I watched Elena tend her rainbow of roses and listened to children playing without fear in their own driveways, I reflected on the journey that had brought us here. It had started with a letter demanding $500,000 in fines and threats to destroy my life. It had ended with the complete dismantling of a system of oppression that had terrorized dozens of families. The weapon Harold had never seen coming was simple. He'd forgotten that behind every piece of property, every lease agreement, and every power structure was a human being capable of fighting back. He'd been so focused on wielding bureaucratic power that he'd never bothered to understand the foundation his power rested on. That foundation had been my building, and when I pulled it out from under him, his entire empire collapsed in exactly 60 days. As I walked past the empty office space that had once housed Harold's headquarters, now being converted into a children's tutoring center by the new HOA, bored, I smiled at the thought of how perfect the justice had been. The building they'd used to control and terrorize the community had become the instrument of their destruction. Harold Morrison had wanted to teach me about property rights and community standards. In the end, I'd taught him something far more important, that every tyrant's power depends on the consent of those he rules over. And sometimes, the most effective rebellion comes not from the street, but from the deed office. The silence in Willowbrook Estates was indeed different now. It wasn't the fearful quiet of people afraid to step out of line. It was the peaceful quiet of neighbors who trusted each other, children who could play safely, and families who could live in their own homes without terror. It was the sound of freedom, and it was beautiful.